Clinical trials are in the context of when we're doing one of two things. We're still trying to find more effective therapies, and or we're still trying to find less toxic therapy. Because if we've got a therapy that cures everyone but with a lot of toxicity, we try to introduce trials that now reduce the toxicity but keep the cure rate high. If our cure rate isn't as high, we're mostly still working on just trying to increase the cure rate. So clinical trials are really the way that in medicine we understand whether something works. It would seem intuitive that if you've got a drug, you should know if it works. But the way we test drugs in animals, actually, the way the tumors respond can be quite different than in human beings. And there are many drugs that are successful in one circumstance, but not in another, that work in one kind of patient, but not another. And therefore, the only way we really know is to actually test them in the patients they're important in. We used to rely a lot on testing of clinical trials in adult patients, and we still do that to some extent, but we've realized that kids are obviously different sizes, their bodies are made up differently, they're growing and developing, so there are some things you cannot determine by actually looking at an adult. The other thing that we've recognized, perhaps one of the I would say the most important advance in the last decade or so, particularly with respect to pediatric brain tumors, is we used to think that kids were little adults, and therefore all of our therapies were based on the kinds of discoveries that were going on in adults. And about a decade ago, when the molecular kind of revolution really came about, we suddenly realized that the genes, the mutations, the abnormalities that start a pediatric tumor going, for the most part, are completely different from what we were seeing in adults. It tells us that, in fact, because many of the mutations are unique to pediatric patients, you're going to have to test the drugs in pediatric patients. And so the concept of a clinical trial is to do just that. Now, testing a clinical trial isn't just about making sure that the drug actually works, although obviously that becomes a critical component. If the drug is so toxic that it can't be tolerated, then the fact that it works doesn't really help. So a drug has to be administered in a way that can be taken by a pediatric patient, can be absorbed, for example, all of those kinds of things. It has to be able to distribute to the place where the tumor is, and in the central nervous system, that's particularly difficult because there's a barrier between the brain and therefore the tumor and the rest of the body. So many drugs that are very effective for body tumors have no activity in brain tumors whatsoever. So doing all of this testing becomes a critical component for saying this is a drug that hits the right kind of tumor in the right kind of patient, that's tolerable, not so toxic it can't be tolerated, and actually has activity. And doing that is done through clinical trials.